In the final summer of the war, when Germany's skies were no longer a sanctuary but a hunting ground for Allied fighters, one Luftwaffe test pilot walked into a hangar and found himself staring at a machine that should never have been there. An American F4U Corsair, intact, gleaming, and radiating the kind of menace that demanded answers. In 45 minutes of flight, he would discover why this aircraft, built for distant oceans, was a threat Germany was not prepared to face. August 1944. The Reich was shrinking, its factories battered, its airfields increasingly targeted, its best pilots gone. Yet inside the secretive testing grounds at Rechlin, the German High Command believed the war could still be influenced, perhaps even redirected, with a clearer understanding of Allied aviation. So when a nearly undamaged Corsair, a fighter that German intelligence had only heard whispers about, arrived unexpectedly from Norway, the Luftwaffe seized upon it with a mix of desperation and scientific hunger. The reports from the Pacific were unsettling. Japanese pilots described the American fighter as unbeatable in a climb, terrifying in a dive and lethal in the hands of a disciplined pilot. Now the Germans had a chance to see for themselves, and the responsibility fell to a man whose life had been defined by flying the unknown, Hans-Werner Lerche. July 1944, northern Norway, under skies heavy with coastal mist and streaked with the smoke of German convoys, Royal Navy Lieutenant Matheson Motley brought his Corsair JT-404 down into a rough field near Bodø, guided by a faltering engine and the knowledge that ditching in the frigid Norwegian sea meant certain death. The landing was brutal, but controlled. The aircraft slid, lurched and finally came to rest intact enough to fight another day. Motley tried to destroy it, first smashing the radio, then attempting to ignite the cockpit, but German patrols were already converging, drawn by the unmistakable howl of the double Wasp engine as it sputtered its last breaths. For the Germans, it was a prize beyond expectation. Here was an F4U-1A, the improved variant with better visibility and upgraded systems, intact, repairable and dripping with secrets. Within hours, the local Wehrmacht command contacted Berlin. By dawn, the next morning orders were moving through encrypted channels. The aircraft was to be transported to Germany immediately by sea, if necessary, no matter the risk or cost. What followed was a logistical operation that spoke to the desperation of 1944 Germany. The Corsair, too damaged to fly and too large to dismantle quickly, was dragged to Narvik, loaded onto a transport ship, and sent south through waters patrolled by Allied submarines and aircraft. 18 days later, covered in salt crystals and streaked with corrosion, it rolled into Rechlin. And in the filtered light of hangar doors warped by repeated bomb blasts, Hans-Werner Lerche stood before the American fighter and understood even before flying it that this machine was not simply another captured aircraft. It was a glimpse into a different philosophy of air combat. He walked slowly around the Corsair, hand running along the leading edge of the inverted gull wings, studying the heavy rivet lines, the massive 2,000 horsepower radial engine, the raised cockpit that promised commanding visibility. He had tested Spitfires, Mustangs, Thunderbolts, even bombers, but this fighter carried a different aura, as if it were less a machine and more a predator waiting to be unleashed. The Corsair had a reputation that preceded it. The Japanese called it whistling death. American pilots swore by its speed, its punch, its ability to climb out of danger, like a creature defying gravity itself. To German engineers, though, much of it was legend. Now, for the first time, they had the chance to strip away myth and confront reality. The aircraft was repaired, the fuel system was patched, the instruments were recalibrated, and on the morning of August 8th, with the sun rising across the cracked concrete of the airfield, Lerche climbed into the cockpit for the flight that would haunt the Luftwaffe High Command. At precisely 0600 hours, with the early August light spreading across the cracked concrete of Rechlin like a thin layer of silver, Hans-Werner Lerche fastened his harness, pulled the Corsair's heavy canopy shut, and found himself immediately struck by how different this American cockpit felt when compared to the cramped, angular interiors of the FW-190 or the Bf-109, because everything inside the F4U-1A seemed organized with almost clinical logic. Clear labels, clean instrument spacing, generous visibility, thanks to the raised seat, and a sense that the aircraft had been designed to remove uncertainty rather than demand compromise. When the ground chief gave him the signal, Lerche pressed the starter, and the Pratt & Whitney R2800 radial engine did not simply come alive. It erupted, unleashing a deep metallic roar that reverberated through the hangar doors and into Lerche's bones, a violent vibration that announced unmistakably that he was sitting atop more raw horsepower than any German fighter currently flying, far beyond the smooth, high-pitched hum of the Daimler-Benz engines he knew so well. As he taxied out, weaving left and right exactly as American prisoners had once described, because forward visibility over the Corsair's massive nose was practically non-existent on the ground, Lerche could sense already that this aircraft demanded its own rules. Then, at the runway threshold, he pushed the throttle forward. The Corsair did not accelerate gradually. It lunged, surging ahead with such brutal force that his head snapped back into the cushion, the tail rising almost instantly, the wheels leaving the pavement with a sense of explosive inevitability, as if the machine were too powerful to remain earthbound for more than a few seconds. And once airborne, climbing through the cool morning air, Lerche felt something he almost never experienced: genuine surprise. The Corsair climbed with a ferocity that bordered on unnatural, gaining altitude with a confidence that made even the superb FW-190 feel pedestrian by comparison. At 3,000 meters he leveled off, began his standard handling checks, and quickly discovered that while the ailerons were heavy and the aircraft somewhat sluggish at low speed, confirming Japanese reports that it was no turn fighter in the classical sense, everything changed the moment he pushed the throttle fully forward and allowed the fighter to stretch its legs. The airspeed indicator began to rise in a way that felt almost irresponsible. 300 knots, then 350, then 400, and still climbing with a steadiness that no German frontline fighter could match, not even in a shallow descent, and certainly not in level flight. The R2800's 2,000 horsepower made itself known in every vibration, every surge of acceleration, every instinctive tightening of Lerche's grip on the stick. But speed alone was not the revelation, because Lerche understood intuitively that the true measure of a fighter's lethality was not how fast it flew in a straight line, but how effectively it used energy, and it was the vertical maneuvers that were about to reveal the Corsair's deepest and most dangerous secret. He climbed to 6,000 meters, stabilized the aircraft, then pulled back sharply into a zoom climb, allowing the fighter to convert pure kinetic energy into altitude. The Corsair leapt upward like a predator, striking from the sea, the altimeter spinning with unsettling enthusiasm. 6,500 meters, then 7,000, then 7,500, continuing past the point where any FW-109 would have already surrendered to gravity. When the stall finally arrived, at roughly 8,200 meters, Lerche was momentarily silent because for the first time he realized that the rumors from the Pacific had not been exaggerations, they had been understated. To confirm the result, he dove first, then pulled the aircraft into a far more aggressive climb, the kind a combat pilot might attempt during an actual boom and zoom engagement. This time the altimeter climbed past 9,000 meters, then 9,500, and finally stalled near 10,400 meters, a figure so far beyond German tactical expectations that Lerche knew instantly this was something the Luftwaffe command would not want to hear. In that moment, as the Corsair hung weightless at the top of its arc, he understood that he was not flying a traditional dogfighter designed to turn inside an opponent or win battles by finesse. He was flying an aircraft built around an entirely different philosophy of combat, one in which altitude, speed, and vertical dominance replaced turning circles and knife-edge engagements. The Corsair, he realized, was not meant to dance with enemy fighters. It was meant to dictate reality, to strike from above with overwhelming energy, to escape effortlessly, and to return before the opponent could recover. Only now did he fully grasp why Japanese pilots had named it Whistling Death, not merely for the sound it made in a dive, but for the sense of hopelessness it imposed on those who tried to fight it. Having confirmed that the Corsair possessed a level of raw power and energy retention unmatched by any German fighter he had ever flown, Lerche transitioned into the next phase of the evaluation, and as he pushed the nose down into a shallow dive, allowing the aircraft to gather speed with the hungry enthusiasm of a predator, sensing its prey, he realized that this stage of the test would determine not merely how the Corsair performed on paper, but how it would behave in the unforgiving logic of combat, where seconds determined survival and altitude was worth more than courage. The dive was smooth. At first, the air flowing over the inverted gull wings in clean, uninterrupted streams. But as the aircraft accelerated through 450 knots, pushing beyond the performance envelope in which most fighters of the era maintained stability, the Corsair continued to respond with a level of composure that felt almost unnatural, the controls heavy but predictable, the airframe trembling with the deep structural groan of compressed airflow while still maintaining obedience to every input. When the speed crossed 500 knots, well above 575 mph, Lerche felt the forces building across the control surfaces like physical weight pressing against the aircraft. Yet even then, the Corsair remained controllable, something that could not be said for the FW-190, which tended to stiffen sharply in high-speed dives, nor for the Bf-109, whose narrow wings made such speeds dangerous, even for experienced pilots. At 4,000 meters he began the pull-out maneuver, and the aircraft responded with a violent surge of G-forces that compressed his ribs, tightened the harness against his chest, and pushed his vision toward the edges of grey. But despite the punishment, he sensed immediately that the Corsair's heavy, robust airframe was not merely surviving the maneuver. It was built for it. Within seconds, the fighter transitioned smoothly from the dive into a climbing arc, and Lerche, regaining his breath, began the stopwatch that would soon deliver the most damning comparison the Luftwaffe had ever documented. The Corsair, climbing now at full throttle, carved its way upward with astonishing momentum, the altimeter rising at a rate that seemed to mock gravity itself. Lerche noted each checkpoint with clinical precision, reaching 5,000 meters in barely over a minute, climbing through 6,000 meters a single minute later, and regaining the original 7,000 meter altitude, in a total of 3 minutes and 35 seconds, a figure that instantly rewrote every tactical assumption German pilots had been trained to believe. He had flown the exact same dive and climb profile in the FW-190A8 just 2 months earlier, and that aircraft, Germany's frontline fighter, the pride of its engineering, had taken 5 minutes and 50 seconds to recover the same altitude. The Corsair, in other words, could strike from above, pull out, climb back to safety, and be ready for another attack 2 minutes and 15 seconds before a German pilot could even return to the same altitude. And those 2 minutes represented not an advantage, but an eternity in the fluid geometry of air combat, where the difference between predator and victim was measured in seconds. As Lerche processed the implications of that number, he understood with chilling clarity that the Corsair's superiority in the vertical plane created a tactical trap from which a German pilot could not realistically escape, because if a German fighter attempted to pursue the Corsair after it pulled out of an attack, it would lose precious energy in a futile chase against an aircraft that was faster in level flight, superior in the dive, and overwhelmingly dominant in the climb, leaving the German pilot not only unable to catch his opponent, but stranded at a lower altitude and dangerously energy depleted, a perfect target for the Corsair's next pass. And if the German pilot refused to pursue, choosing instead to preserve his energy and climb, then the Corsair would simply convert its speed into altitude and position itself above him again, free to attack at the moment of its choosing, which meant that in both possible scenarios, pursuit or restraint, the German pilot lost control of the engagement. To confirm this paradox, Lerche simulated a defensive scenario in which a German FW-190 attacked the Corsair from above, exactly the situation in which the Luftwaffe traditionally excelled. He rolled the Corsair sharply, felt the sluggish response of the heavy ailerons, recognized instantly that the aircraft could not outturn a German fighter at low speeds, and briefly imagined what a real FW-190 pilot might do in the same moment. Then he executed the maneuver that a well-trained American pilot would employ. He leveled the wings, shoved the throttle to the firewall, and allowed the Corsair's monstrous engine to drag the aircraft forward like a fist tearing through the sky. Within seconds, the airspeed indicator passed 300 knots, then 350, then 400, and at that moment, Lerche pulled into a climbing turn that prioritized energy over turn radius. The separation was immediate and decisive. Within 15 seconds, the theoretical pursuer had lost his firing opportunity, and within 30 seconds, the Corsair was pulling comfortably away, immune to further attack, unless the German pilot possessed an altitude advantage of more than 1,500 meters. This, Lerche realized, was the Corsair's most terrifying feature, not its speed, not its firepower, not its stability in the dive, but its strategic inevitability. Because when flown correctly, it never had to fight on equal terms, never had to enter a turning duel, never had to expose itself to prolonged danger. It could simply appear above you, strike with devastating speed, and vanish upward again, leaving you with only the sound of its receding engine, and the knowledge that it would return at the moment of its choosing. Even though Lerche was already convinced that the Corsair represented a fundamental shift in fighter design philosophy, he knew that no evaluation would be complete without identifying its vulnerabilities, and so he began a series of slow-speed tests, easing back the throttle and allowing the aircraft to bleed energy until it entered the very regime in which German fighters, especially the Bf 109, with its narrow wings and vicious instantaneous turn rate, were supposed to dominate. Yet even as the speed dropped below 150 knots, and the Corsair's heavy ailerons began to resist every input, like iron hinges frozen in winter frost, Lerche understood instinctively that the problem wasn't whether the FW 109 could outmaneuver the Corsair at low speed, but whether they could ever force it into such a fight in the first place, because no disciplined Corsair pilot would willingly allow himself to slow down enough to make the aircraft vulnerable. Still, he pushed further, taking the fighter toward the stall, raising the nose gently, letting the airspeed unwind until the entire aircraft felt as if it were balancing on the edge of a razor. Then, without warning, the left wing snapped down viciously, the Corsair rolling inverted with such sudden authority that Lerche had to react on instinct alone to recover, and though he managed to regain control quickly, the message was unmistakable in slow-speed maneuvering. The Corsair was treacherous, prone to asymmetric stall behavior, and unforgiving in the hands of an inexperienced pilot. A FW 190 could exploit this, he thought, if it ever had the opportunity to get close enough, if the Corsair pilot ever made the mistake of allowing his speed to decay, if the engagement somehow collapsed from energy fighting into a knife fight at low altitude. It was too many ifs for wartime realities. Visibility posed another challenge. Lerche lowered the nose and tested the forward view, noting that even with the improved raised cockpit of the 1A variant, the Corsair still carried a massive blind spot directly ahead and below, a blind zone large enough for a determined German pilot to hide in during a turning engagement, yet only if the Corsair turned, which a competent pilot would never do when he possessed the greatest climb rate in the sky. He continued probing the aircraft's limits, pushing the nose over into a steep dive to test high-speed control harmony, and discovered that, once the speed exceeded 520 knots, the controls stiffened to the point where pulling out of the dive required enormous physical strength, far greater than the average pilot could muster for long, and certainly enough to induce blackouts if the pullout was attempted too late. Yet even this weakness felt muted when set beside the aircraft's overwhelming advantages, because the Corsair did not need to dive as steeply as German fighters to reach lethal speeds. The sheer horsepower of the double Wasp allowed it to maintain attacking velocity without entering dangerous dive angles. After nearly 45 minutes in the air, Lerche began to ease the Corsair into its descent toward Rechlin, weaving left and right in the landing pattern so he could see around the aircraft's colossal nose, and during that slow, methodical approach, he composed the structure of his report mentally, knowing already that what he had learned during this flight would be deeply unwelcome in Berlin. His assessment was not ambiguous, not philosophical, not speculative. It was blunt, empirical, and from the Luftwaffe's perspective, catastrophic. By the time he rolled out on final approach and felt the main wheels strike the runway with a heavy, confident thud, he knew that this aircraft, this captured American naval fighter, salt-stained from the journey, repaired with German parts and tested under German skies, posed a threat that Luftwaffe command would not want to acknowledge, much less confront. Because the truth was simple and devastating, the Corsair was not merely a superior machine, it belonged to a different evolutionary branch of air combat thinking, one in which altitude, energy, and vertical maneuvering replaced the turning duels and horizontal engagements Germany had spent years perfecting. He taxied back toward Hangar 7, shut down the massive radial engine, climbed out of the cockpit, and walked straight to the technical office with the urgency of a man carrying a message he knew would be ignored. Lerche entered the technical office still feeling the lingering vibration of the Corsair's radial engine in his bones, and without removing his flight suit, without pausing for coffee or conversation, he sat at his desk, unrolled a stack of engineering papers, and began writing with the relentless focus of someone who understood that every minute mattered, filling page after page with observations, numbers, and tactical insights that contradicted not only German expectations, but the very foundation of Luftwaffe air doctrine, because what he had just flown was not another Allied fighter to be catalogued and compared, but a machine whose design philosophy rendered conventional German tactics obsolete the moment it appeared in the sky. His handwriting remained tight, precise, and mechanical as he outlined the Corsair's maximum speeds, acceleration rates, dive stability, zoom climb performance, stall behavior, and structural resilience. Every line distilled from the hard physics of flight rather than the optimistic assumptions that had begun infecting German intelligence reports by 1944. He documented the Corsair's ability to retain energy in vertical maneuvers, its astonishing climb rate, 40% superior to the FW-190A8 under combat conditions, its capacity to regain altitude after a boom and zoom dive nearly 2.5 minutes faster than any German frontline fighter, and the stability of its 6.50 caliber machine guns during high-speed firing, which allowed long, accurate bursts even when the airframe was trembling under extreme aerodynamic load. Then came the section that mattered most: tactical implications. Lerche wrote with the same brutal honesty that had earned him respect as Reichlin's most reliable test pilot, explaining that the Corsair was not designed to win turning engagements, but to dominate vertical ones, and that any German attempt to challenge it in the energy regime would result in catastrophic losses. He noted that a Corsair pilot, properly trained, would never allow the aircraft to drop into the speed ranges where German fighters held an advantage, and that the Corsair's power-to-weight ratio ensured that even a defensive engagement could be transformed into an escape and climb maneuver within seconds. He recommended that German fighters avoid engaging the Corsair altogether unless they held a minimum altitude advantage of 1,500 meters and a decisive positional edge, and even then, he warned that the Corsair's acceleration could neutralize such an advantage in moments. The conclusion of the 14-page report carried the kind of sentence that no German officer in 1944 wanted to read. The F4U Corsair is superior to all current Luftwaffe fighter aircraft in the energy fighting regime. If deployed to the European theater in significant numbers, it will pose a severe threat to German air operations. Lerche signed his name at the bottom, handed the report to the courier responsible for delivering it through the labyrinth of Reichlin's administrative channels, and walked out of the office knowing with a cold certainty that he had just placed his signature not on a technical document, but on a political problem. His report was too honest, too direct, too numerically undeniable to be dismissed, yet far too damaging to align with the illusions that Germany's upper command still clung to in the final stages of the war. 3 days later, a terse telegram summoned him to Berlin. The meeting took place in a grey, windowless room inside the Luftwaffe ministry, illuminated by a single lamp that cast long shadows across a polished table. A general staff officer. Lerche never learned his name, only the icy detachment in his voice. Sat across from him, turning pages of the report with the mechanical patience of a man searching not for truth, but for grounds to reject it. The officer questioned every detail, every speed measurement, every altitude reading, demanding to know whether the captured Corsair might have been modified, whether the repair work performed in Norway had altered performance, whether Lerche had considered that the aircraft's reputation in the Pacific might be exaggerated. Lerche answered calmly, repeating that the data had been recorded with precision instruments, that the aircraft behaved exactly as its engineering specifications suggested it should, and that the performance envelope he had documented was not theoretical but measurable, repeatable, and undeniable. The officer closed the folder, paused for a long moment, and delivered the verdict with a tone that blended forced politeness with unmistakable dismissal. Your technical observations are noted. However, your tactical conclusions are premature. The Corsair is a naval aircraft. It will not be deployed in Europe in significant numbers. This report will be classified and distributed only on a need-to-know basis. It was not a rebuttal. It was a burial. Lerche walked out of the ministry understanding fully that the truth he had flown, measured and reported would not shape Luftwaffe strategy, because the war Germany was fighting in 1944 was no longer grounded in reality. It was shaped by denial, wounded pride, and a refusal to acknowledge that the Allies had surpassed them not only in numbers but in engineering, doctrine and adaptability. The Corsair report had become another casualty of that refusal. But the story of the Corsair inside Germany did not end there. Lerche returned to Rechlin, carrying the quiet frustration of a man who had done everything right, flown the aircraft to its limits, recorded the data with precision, delivered the truth without political varnish, only to watch that truth be sealed away inside a classified folder, buried under the weight of wishful thinking and institutional pride. Yet even as he resumed his routine of testing new aircraft, filing new reports and navigating the increasingly chaotic environment of late-war Germany, he sensed that the Corsair evaluation had begun to acquire a life of its own, slipping through the cracks of bureaucracy in the way only important truths can. Within weeks, photocopies, unofficial, poorly typed, sometimes missing pages, began circulating inside Luftwaffe fighter units. Pilots passed them hand to hand, sometimes folded inside flight jackets, sometimes exchanged during briefings, sometimes slid across tables in dimly lit barracks with the quiet urgency of contraband. It no longer mattered that the report had been classified, because the frontline pilots, the men who lived or died by the capabilities of their machines, were starving for honest intelligence, and Lerche's analysis, blunt and factual and utterly unflinching, was precisely the kind of document they trusted. Some squadrons dismissed it as irrelevant, because the Corsair was a naval aircraft, and the war in Europe seemed unlikely to see American carrier fighters sweeping over the continent. Others studied the report with intense interest, recognizing that even if the Corsair never appeared in European skies, the principles behind its design revealed the widening technological gap between Allied and German engineering. A few seasoned pilots, men who had survived years of combat, read the section on vertical maneuvering and remarked quietly that if the Americans ever produced a land-based fighter built on the same philosophy, the Luftwaffe would face an enemy it could not outsmart or outrun. Meanwhile, Lerche continued his work at Rechlin, testing 14 more captured aircraft in the final 6 months of the war. Spitfires, Mustangs, P-38 Lightnings, P-47 Thunderbolts, and each report reinforced the same grim pattern. The Allies were no longer catching up to German aviation. They had surpassed it decisively, and Germany lacked both the time and the industrial capacity to respond. Yet the Corsair remained unique in his mind, because in its flight characteristics, in its violent acceleration and near limitless vertical potential, it represented not merely superior engineering, but a complete shift in the logic of air combat, a leap from which there was no return to earlier doctrines. The Corsair was not designed to fight German fighters. It was designed to render their tactics obsolete. By early 1945, as Soviet forces closed in from the east and Allied bombers pounded German infrastructure daily, rumors circulated that Lerche's Corsair report had reached several high-ranking officers who had never been intended to read it. Some recognized its warning as prophetic. Others dismissed it as defeatist or irrelevant. In the end, none of it mattered. The war had already turned irreversibly against Germany, long before Lerche ever climbed into the cockpit of the American fighter. What remained, however, was a quiet irony, one that Lerche himself would come to appreciate only after the war ended. The Corsair, the most dangerous aircraft he ever flew, the machine whose performance had stunned him into professional admiration, never came to Europe in meaningful numbers. It remained a creature of the Pacific, where it carved out an extraordinary combat record, achieving an 11-1 kill ratio and earning the loyalty of every Marine and Navy pilot who flew it. It battled Zeros, Hamps and Oscars, not FW-190 Corsair or BF-109 Corsair. German pilots, armed with Lerche's warnings, never faced the Corsair in combat. But the lesson he had written in that 14-page report, ignored by the command that demanded optimism instead of truth, would outlive the war. And Hans-Werner Lerche, the man whose honesty had been quietly punished by his own superiors, would soon find himself in a position he never expected, working for the very nation whose aircraft he had admired at Rechlin, testing German fighters not for the Luftwaffe, but for the United States Army Air Forces in the aftermath of Germany's surrender. When Germany collapsed in the spring of 1945, and the remnants of its military infrastructure disintegrated under the pressure of advancing Allied armies, Lerche made the same decision that thousands of surviving Luftwaffe personnel ultimately faced. He fled west rather than east. Preferring American captivity to the brutal uncertainty of Soviet hands, the once meticulously organized testing grounds at Rechlin were now little more than a patchwork of bomb craters, burned-out workshops, and abandoned prototypes, and the pilots who had once spoken in the precise technical language of airspeed, manifold pressure, and climb rates now spoke only of escape routes. Lerche surrendered to advancing American forces with the quiet composure of a man who understood the value of the knowledge he carried. He was neither boastful nor fearful. Instead, he conducted himself like a professional pilot, whose war had been fought not in ideology, but in test flights, acceleration charts, and engineering reports. The Americans recognized this immediately. They knew his name from captured documents, from intelligence briefings, and from testimonies of other German personnel. He was not merely a pilot, he was a catalogue of airborne experience, a man who had flown more Allied aircraft than many Allied pilots. Within weeks, he was recruited into a program the Americans had quietly been assembling, a mirror image of what he had done for Germany. Just as he had studied the strengths and weaknesses of captured Allied fighters, he was now asked to evaluate German aircraft for the US Army Air Forces. The irony was not lost on him, and later, in interviews decades after the war, he would remark that the transition felt strangely natural. "I simply continued the same work," he said, "except the uniforms around me had changed." And it was in those post-war test flights, with American crews standing where German crews had once stood, that Lerche finally gained the perspective his wartime environment had denied him. The P-47 Thunderbolts, he had once considered heavy and ungainly, were now revealed as engines of brute force. The P-51 Mustangs, he had admired at Rechlin, were now contextualized as masterpieces of range, stability, and combat endurance. And of course the F-4U Corsair, the aircraft that had shocked him in August 1944, was now understood not as an anomaly but as part of a broader American industrial philosophy that embraced over-engineering durability and adaptability rather than the razor-thin margins of German design. In the post-war years, as he worked with American engineers, he discovered that the Corsair's extraordinary performance had never been an accident. It was the result of a design approach that began with a single question: how do we build an aircraft that always controls the fight? And from that question came the engine, the structure, the armament, and the operational doctrine that defined the Corsair's character. The Americans had designed it not to survive combat, but to dominate it. As the Cold War began to dawn and Lerche settled into a quieter life, he wrote extensively about his wartime experiences, producing memoirs and technical papers that would later become essential reading for aviation historians. Among them was his account of the Corsair flight, a story he recounted without bitterness, without nostalgia, and without self-aggrandizement, describing instead the aircraft's raw power, its peculiar handling quirks, its crushing acceleration, and above all the lesson it had taught him about truth in wartime. For in that single 45-minute flight, he had learned something far more important than the aerodynamic characteristics of a naval fighter. He had learned that institutions which refuse to listen to uncomfortable truths doom themselves long before the enemy ever reaches their gates. And so, in 1956, when his memoir Luftwaffe Test Pilot was published, the Corsair chapter stood out not because it chronicled a remarkable aircraft, but because it revealed the quiet, painful contrast between scientific honesty and political denial. The Corsair, Lerche wrote, had been the most impressive fighter I ever flew, but the part he did not need to explain, because every reader could see it, was that the Luftwaffe had ignored that impression, dismissed the warning, and buried the report because it contradicted the narrative the High Command desperately wanted to believe. Hans-Werner Lerche died in 1993, at the age of 75, long after the Corsair had retired from active service, long after the war was reduced to documentaries, museum displays, and aging veterans' memories. Yet his story, and especially that one flight on a clear August morning in 1944, remains a testament to a timeless truth that sometimes a single honest report, written by a solitary pilot in a collapsing nation, can reveal more about the fate of a war than 1,000 speeches delivered by men who refuse to face reality. In the end, the story of Hans-Werner Lerche and the captured Corsair is not merely the story of a single test flight conducted behind the strained walls of a dying regime, nor is it simply a tale of technical superiority measured in knots, climb rates, and horsepower. Rather, it is a quiet parable about the consequences of denial in a world where the truth, no matter how uncomfortable, demands to be heard. Lerche stepped into that cockpit in August 1944, expecting to evaluate an airplane, but what he actually confronted was the widening chasm between Germany's belief in its own aerial supremacy and the stark, data-driven reality that its opponents had long since surpassed it. His 14-page report, filled with numbers that did not flatter the Reich and conclusions that did not soothe its leadership, became a mirror held up to a system that had lost the ability to look at itself honestly, and in that mirror he saw the fatal flaw that would haunt the Luftwaffe until the very last day of the war: the refusal to accept inconvenient truths, even when they were delivered by the one man tasked with uncovering them. Lerche's flight in the Corsair endures not because it changed the course of the conflict. It did not, but because it symbolized a moment when clarity pierced the fog of a collapsing military doctrine, revealing with painful precision that engineering brilliance, tactical innovation, and industrial might had shifted decisively to the other side of the world. The Corsair, with its monstrous engine and impossible vertical performance, embodied the future. The Luftwaffe, buried under layers of bureaucracy and denial, remained chained to the past. And when an organization, any organization, chooses comforting illusions over empirical truth, defeat becomes not a possibility, but an inevitability. That is why Lerche's story matters today. It is a reminder that wars are not lost only in combat. They are lost in boardrooms and ministries, where leaders insist that reality conform to their expectations, instead of allowing their expectations to conform to reality. It is a reminder that the courage to speak plainly, to measure honestly, and to acknowledge weakness is often more valuable than any machine built of metal and rivets. And it is a reminder that sometimes a single pilot, alone in the cockpit of a foreign aircraft, can see a nation's fate with greater clarity than the generals who claim to lead it. Lerche flew the Corsair for 45 minutes. In that brief span of time, he saw a truth that his superiors refused to face. History, however, did not refuse. It remembered,